Ladies and gentlemen and everyone, thank you so much for coming this evening to us here at the Open Society Foundations, where we have the pleasure of being joined by Wolfgang Kaleck of the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights in Berlin, Executive Director of the same. And it's a great pleasure to have you here. Wolfgang is many of you probably already know, has spent many years as an activist human rights lawyer working for accountability, mainly using the German court system. In particular, he's worked considerably in Argentina on seeking accountability for the victims of the military dictatorship in Argentina in the 70s and 80s. And also he was involved with the US-based Center for Constitutional Rights on litigation against Donald Rumsfeld over US torture in the post 9/11 CIA campaign, and also Abu Ghraib as well. So Wolfgang has written a book. Here it is. It's a very attractive red color. Law versus Power, which, having read it, is essentially the theme of much of your life's work, I would say. You've been law against the power. So I'd ask you now to begin with, very simply, well, why did you write the book, and why now?
First of all, thank you very much, and thanks to OSF for hosting this event, and good evening to everybody. I wrote the book for a number of reasons. One is that I wrote it for myself in the very first place. It was important for me to get a little bit of because it was not foreseen what I did. It was my career I wanted to be a domestic criminal lawyer, and I did it, and then I did other things within Germany, and then from the late 90s on, in the aftermath of the Pinochet prosecution in Spain, I got more and more involved, and then it basically changed my whole life. And it went all so fast, and it was so much that at some point I had, and I was always going for more and somewhere else, and discovering another part of the world, getting involved, that at some point I had to write it down. That was the one thing. And the other thing was that some of my friends were saying, look, that's exactly what you have to communicate also to younger lawyers, because we have not so many, lawyers who are experienced on that field. The education in law school is dominated by others. So it was a mixture. And then I was hesitating with the English translation because, you have so many international lawyers here. So I was thinking, okay, do they really need the account of a German lawyer? The publisher was saying yes, but then the publisher needed some time. And then something happened that, in parts of the book have at least a slightly optimistic tone, and it was written only 3 years away from now, and I was at some point not really sure if I can uphold this tone. And so then I wrote several versions of a foreword for the English translation, and one of them was so depressing that the editor had said, Wolfgang, we cannot use that. And then, so it's in a way now it's kind of reconciling with that, but it was it's tough to see how in only 3 years the scenario all over the world changed so much.
Right. Although you could say this book was written really, the first part of your career was really during the high watermark, perhaps, of the human rights movement. Yeah. And also accountability with the foundation of the International Criminal Court. But even in your stories, there's a fair amount of things not working out. You brought a lot of lawsuits in Germany, but you had a lot of heroic failure as well. So I'm kind of interested in, when you look back, you were optimistic, though, despite the failures. So how do you see the role of that kind of human rights action?
Look, I had the luck, first of all, I had the luck to work with the Argentinian Madres de Plaza de Mayo, and with a smaller group, subgroup, with the German Jewish mothers, and that was such an enriching experience that, that is basically, that was already in 10, 15 years ago, enough for my lifetime to have made this experience. And then, we wanted to file, similar Pinochet-like cases in Germany, which we did in 1998. So the plan existed before the arrest. Then we felt encouraged to the 1998 October 16th arrest in London, and then. But basically, we thought, okay, we filed some complaints, we bring the issue on the agenda and back on the agenda in Germany, also the German complicity into these crimes, the complicity of the transnational corporations and so on. But we had never really expected that the Germans would open a serious investigation, which they did. And not only that, Germany released arrest warrants against Videla and Macera, the two surviving junta members, and then also released extradition warrants. And that was basically, that was my first set of cases. And if you have lived through that, that is quite a good portion of energy, we get from there. And moreover, the approach was then, don't ask me about the prospects of the case. This is an open process. We do everything that it works out, but it's very clear. It's not only about us; it's about all of us. Many of us. There are legal and political struggles, and the more people who will join us, the better are the prospects. And to have made this experience in the very first significant cases, carries me.
And these were cases brought in the German courts on behalf of victims or families where family members had been disappeared by Argentinian.
Yeah, especially Jewish families where the parents fled from Germany to escape the Nazis, find a base in Argentina. Their children get engaged in social and leftist movements in Argentina, and then got arrested, tortured, disappeared. And
And this is using international law.
It's using universal basically what we call universal jurisdiction.
Right.
As I said, similar efforts have been made in Spain and in France and Italy, and that all together, and then the next stage, because we haven't filed these cases to have Videla, Macera, and the others in a German court. We always thought it's more sensible to have them in Argentina, sitting on the bench. And that is what happened then. And that is what Naomi Roth-Ariasas describes as the Pinochet effect, meaning, if the remedies in the country where the crimes have committed are somehow exhausted, if there is a blockade in one country, you try to get an impulse somewhere else. That may be the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, that may be the European Court of Human Rights, but that may nowadays it may be the ICC, but it can also be universal jurisdiction cases. And that is basically what happened in the Argentinian cases, that at some point Nestor Kirchner, the then elected president in Argentina, said, we should better do it in our country with the Argentinian justice system. And the other thing, the very important experience is the very powerful human rights movement we had there. And it was never a contradiction, as it's often described here in New York or in Berlin. People would say, but litigation can have consequences for the social movement and so on and so on. And here you had the social movement giving the direction and having developed a very, very broad toolbox, going from social mobilization, from the escraches, little demonstrations in front of the houses of the military, to many artists who are involved, and the lawyers, and they all consider their efforts as complementary. And coming from a part of the world where people are more keen to see differences between different groups and maintain their own little, thing, that was very, very helpful.
Actually, at this point, I wasn't really going to talk about this, but as a European human rights lawyer, I'm interested in how you see the American human rights lawyer business. I mean, you know, obviously work closely. Yeah, I think we should go for it. I think people are ready for that, right? Let's go for it.
No, I mean, let's denationalize the topic. We have come across a number of people who were affected, for example, by corporations, who had survived human rights violations and were approached by lawyers from wherever. And one of their experience were lawyer coming from big cities, from flying in for a week, making them sign powers of attorney, promising them whatever, and then leaving and never seen again. And that was definitely the kind of approach we don't want to pursue. Rather, following the advices of my dear friend Colin Gonsalves from the Human Rights Law Network in India, who was at some point when we founded the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights in Berlin, was saying, look, it's nice to know that we have now some lawyers in Europe and that you are willing to bring some of our cases into European courts, but I would like to invite you to come to India and learn about India and sit down with us and strategize. And, like not taking our cases and, let's say, the paternalistic approach, let's show the barbars how justice functions, rather than an approach where we sit down in an early stage of a case, possible potential cases, and sit down what does make sense. And often we would come to the solution that it makes sense at the same time use domestic remedies as well as other transnational or international remedies, and to find a way to make it in a sensible way to really carry out a strategic plan, to make it more strategic than it was before. And there is a great need for that, in many great desire for that. And from my point of view, it's also very important that we have to be very clear about the different positions. The human rights activists and lawyers in other countries are much less privileged than we are. They have less resources, and their work is much more dangerous. And so that's also something where we have to do. It's a part of our work is also solidarity work, and a level of solidarity which wasn't existent before, because lawyers originally, we have a strong tradition of lawyers in many countries who were only working for the elites, and so lawyers who work on the transnational level in these kind of cases, that's a fairly new tradition, but something is growing.
Right, and that would be the case in Germany, right? That this kind of human rights litigation is not a kind of widespread activity. I mean, I'm interested because people in the United States, they see the United States where litigation is, and people know the name of Supreme Court rulings in the way that I'm British. I don't know the name of any Supreme Court ruling in the United Kingdom Supreme Court. But here, people know the names. They're familiar with litigation being used to bring about social change. So how would you characterize the situation in Germany and other parts of Western Europe?
Look, it's difficult. I mean, at some point, we all tried to catch what we are doing or frame it as strategic litigation. I'm a little bit skeptical right now because, who wouldn't subscribe to title his or her work as strategic? It's really not really saying a lot. That's the one thing. And the other thing is exactly what you're pointing to. The lawyers are taking over, and then the discussion is about the Supreme Court ruling. The discussion is about Article 5, Sentence 4, last half sentence. And rather than to discuss can a lawsuit, can litigation have an impact on a situation where human rights have been or are violated. And that was an approach that was brought to us. The transnational lawyering was obviously in Europe not as developed as here. I mean, you had a lot of, above all, the Alien Tort Claims Act lawyering. And then, of course, I mean, as the US is so powerful, and as so many US actors, may it be state actors, may it be corporations, are involved in so many human rights violations all over the world, you could build up quite a tradition of lawyering here. And that was definitely underdeveloped. But there was a great interest, but not only of the usual suspects in the human rights scene, but for example, a lot of support we got in the beginning of development organization, of church development organization, who were particularly interested that we work together and cooperate with communities they support. So the approach was then different. We were not discussing anymore, yes, that was, of course we have to discuss about the prospects of a case. And of course we have to develop a professional, serious legal argumentation. But the overall question is another one. We're not asking ourselves, do we win or lose the case? The question is, does that help the community? Does that help in the situation? And that is a perspective brought in by development organization, by churches, who are also very interested in that. So slightly different development, slightly different scene.
Over your time as a lawyer, how do you think your attitude towards the value of law has changed?
Let me say, first of all, what I think now, I think more, maybe I became a little bit more modest. Because I had the same disease as many other lawyers, thinking that you are basically the center of everything, while especially the criminal lawyers are like that. And I was a criminal lawyer all my professional life. And I think I got a better feeling right now how our legal efforts can be embedded in broader political and social struggles, that they need to be embedded, otherwise they have less impact. That's the one thing. And the other thing is, I have also gained much more experiences that in many of the cases which you eventually might consider as a failure, our contribution had positive impacts. So I consider, but rather to evaluate if we departed from A and reached point B, I'm considering this as more and more as a political legal struggle, with some steps, advancing some steps, some failures, but I also acknowledge that we could move on in the last 20 years. That the talk about accountability, even about corporate accountability, is much more. It's you don't need to explain it that much. The enforcement of social and economic rights, which was not on the agenda 10 years ago. The first wave was about universal jurisdiction, was about the Pinochets of the world, about torture and massacres. And around about 10 years ago, the whole business and human rights scene developed very, very much, which I consider really as important. Then you see huge developments in nearly every country in the global south. And you go there and you see dozens and dozens of young lawyers throwing themselves into these battles, and that's really encouraging. And so I'm it's not only the lawyer-centered approach, but it's also the Western lawyer-centered approach. I think I hope I lost that a little bit.
But you talked a bit, I think, in the book about law, when you were young, seeing law as being there just to protect the elite.
Yeah, that was, of course, but that was a very particular view of let's say, state, critical towards the state, towards criminal law, towards prison, and with a lot of confirmation in history, criminal law being used as a tool of oppression against, the right people. It was nice. Then I started to work as a lawyer in East Berlin. I come from West Germany, started my career in the early 90s in East Berlin, in the United Berlin. And then I get involved in two sets of cases. The one set is our first office was installed in the headquarters of the former East German opposition. And these people had been surveyed and mistreated by the Stasi. So they would come to us. And so I think my first great article was how to access the Stasi files, something that was not particularly trained for, and nobody was trained for. So we had to do a lot with the Stasi victims. And the other set of cases is really sad, because it's until now, it's the violence of the neo-Nazis especially all over East Germany. So my law firm starts to get very involved. So we travel around East Germany and defend victims of punks and people of different color and people who look and behave different, who got beaten up or sometimes even killed. So there I experience, of course, there I ask for the police and the prosecutor to act, because we had in parts of East Germany, for years lawless zones, which I haven't expected to be the case in Germany. So that changes my mind, and of course then the experience with Guatemala and Argentina and the other Latin American countries.
Right, and also you've seen how the change of governments affect outcomes in lawsuits or in trials. The idea of the case or the trial being sort of sacrosanct and not affected by a political environment is not something you.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that certain human rights movements in certain historical moments frame their work as neutral, as apolitical. That might be a protection, but I think on the long run, that's the wrong take. We have to repoliticize human rights, and we have to make very clear that at the end of the day, we move within the legal discourse, we use the legal language, and we want legal decisions. But at the end of the day, the bigger problems will be solved on a political level, and that is something I think we have to spell out and we have to make very clear, because the human rights movement suffered a number of tragic failures and law reforms. For example, in Europe, the universal jurisdiction was on rise at the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, especially in Spain and in Belgium. And but I think lawyers and NGOs, human rights NGOs, underestimated the political pressure and were not really prepared to counter it. Mm-hmm. And then the laws were basically reformed in a way that the concept of universal jurisdiction is basically disappeared in those two countries where we had a lot of expectations there. Mm-hmm. And I think so at the same time you have to be a lawyer, but you have to also to be an advocate for your cases and for that kind of work.
Right. So I'm going to throw this open for questions in a moment, but I'm going to finish with a question which I said I was going to ask you pretty early on, which is you're now representing Edward Snowden in Europe. So can you tell us a little bit what that involves? What's that been like?
Yeah, I mean, I just spoke to Eric, one of our alumni from ECCHR, who is now working here. And, about Germany as the light tower of liberal democracy. When we started to develop a strategy for Edward Snowden in 2013, we got a little bit of a different impression. It was so evident that the threat of of prosecution here in the U.S. is so completely arbitrary. It's so contrary to every standard, international, national standard, but also let's say ethical standards. I mean, the Espionage Act from 1914 is a masterpiece of political persecution, and it should be abolished rather than invoked, which has happened here in the last year. And it would allow to convict Edward for every single transmission of data for around about 30 years, up to 30 years, and that would accumulate to thousands and thousands years of prison. And if they would apply the standards they apply to other whistleblowers, he would sit in a maximum security prison and under special administration measures, SAM, for his whole life. And that is known to the European policymakers. And so they invented all kind of excuses why they cannot give a safe stay to him. But of the end of the day, it was very clear. It was once again the double standards, exercised by Western states. The whistleblower of my enemy is my friend, and my own whistleblower is my enemy until today. And that was, it was really heartbreaking. That was also a kind of, let's say, experience I cannot argue that easy away, because it's not a good feeling to know where he is now and to know in what danger he is. That is something, but it's very clear. We had it very clear from the very beginning. It's depending from the political will of all involved countries what happens to him. We can only, as lawyers, we can only prepare the field. We can tell the Germans, the French, the Swedish, look, your argument that he cannot enter Germany because he has no valid passport is stupid. Look at this law. Your argument that as soon as he enters, he has to be extradited to the US is stupid because this is political prosecution. This is an obstacle to extradition, and so on and so on. So we are prepared to counter these arguments because they hide away behind legal arguments, and that's stupid. It's the lack of political will, and that is lasting until now.
Right. So thank you. So at this point, I'm going to ask for questions. I need to remind everyone that this is being recorded on camera and also the sound, and will hopefully be posted on our website unless something goes horribly wrong. And therefore, there is a microphone somewhere in the room. Is there a microphone somewhere in the room? There should be a microphone somewhere in the room. We should find one. In failing that,
we can also repeat the question.
We can also repeat the question. Good point. So let's. I was going to take 2 or so questions at a time, but since we have to remember what it is and repeat it, could somebody like to ask a question? Do we have any questions? Yes, sir. Could you identify yourself and then?
My name is Roberto Bertelli, and I was wondering.
Roberto Rosselli, right?
Your thoughts on the Venezuelan human rights situation in the current government.
And the question is for Wolfgang's thoughts on the Venezuelan human rights situation at the moment.
Okay, I thought you collected a little bit.
No, I think I just tried one.
Look, I'm not the super judge. So I'm not involved in the Venezuelan situation. To my knowledge, a number of serious human rights violations have been committed, and they definitely have to be investigated and prosecuted. I'm not sure, and that is an open question I discussed with a number of legal scholars during the last week. I'm not sure if this amounts to crimes against humanity. I'm just not sure. I know that the ICC, Office of the Prosecutor, has a look into it, but we'll see. We'll see, because from my point of view, it's in the gray zone between tough repression against opposition and crimes against humanity, which requires something more. So it's in between, but anyway, something should happen, and I hope that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights is anyhow a right forum to address much of what has happened in Venezuela.
I'm going to interrupt interrupt the audience's questions by asking my own question, because I'm the guy with the mic. The Inter-American Court System and Commission for Human Rights and the European Court for Human Rights, how much faith do you have in them, or what do you see their role as being?
I mean, their role is incredibly important, and we had recently a conference in Berlin where we had representatives of both courts, and their cases and their development over the last 30 years is so incredible. Especially the Inter-American Court of Human Rights was really a trendsetter. So it was awful to hear that this court is getting drowned. I mean, the representatives had to go to Europe to fundraise. I mean, here we have a serious court, which is so important for the whole region, and these people have to go to Europe fundraising. That's shameful. And in the European Court of Human Rights, we're facing also a problem that more and more governments want to get more and more involved. So especially the selection of the judges has become a very an issue of government politics. And second, when it comes to topics around migration and counterterrorism, there is a lot of pressure also of governments. And so not only the usual suspects, Turkey and Russia, the most convicted country in Strasbourg at the European Court, but unfortunately also countries like the UK. You know, they complain about the case, the torture cases, the torture Iraq cases where they got convicted. Countries like France, but also the infamous Copenhagen initiatives, where, you know, a core European country, usually liberal as Denmark, basically proposed introduced similar thoughts as they are usual in Turkey and in Russia, to have another, you violate the law you have to exhaust the whole every instance in your all domestic remedies. Then you go to the court convicts you, and what they now want is another round within the domestic justice system, which is basically making the court really less impactful. And that is serious tendencies in, unfortunately, those two continents who have the most far developed human rights protection system. That's definitely not the right example for other parts of the world.
Right. I find the sunny and upbeat way of looking at this is when people say that human rights don't matter or it doesn't change anything. In that case, why are governments so obsessed with trying to obstruct human rights? So in some ways, the optimistic perspective would be that it attests to the power of the human rights institutions.
Definitely. I completely agree. But we have to be prepared that then the governments strike back, and we have to counter that now, and not, it's not like an automatism. Like the golden age of human rights is coming closer and closer. It's a struggle, and we have to throw ourselves into this struggle.
Yes, may I ask? Yes.
Microphone.
You have to tell me. I have to repeat it.
Okay. My name is Natalia Krapiva. I am a public prosecutor here in the U.S. and I've been doing some work on Syria international law. My question is about Syria. ECCHR has been doing amazing work helping to bring Syrian cases under universal jurisdiction in Germany and Austria and other countries. And I just wanted to ask you, first of all, what do you think? It's been amazing that it's been possible to do that, but I wonder, first of all, what is sort of the biggest challenges to having more of these prosecutions happening, and whether do you see in the future there will be any possibility of prosecuting those cases on a more international level as in special tribunal or at the ICC?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question.
I just summarize the question. It's a question from Natalia, who's a public prosecutor in the US, who's been working on Syria crimes and seen progress with the ECCHR in courts in Europe. So what are the prospects for substantive prosecutions for crimes against humanity and war crimes in Syria, in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, thank you for the question. First of all, it's a disaster for the international community that these crimes have been committed since 2011 and are about to be committed until now. Second, it's another disaster for the international community that there is no international tribunal, neither the ICC nor tribunal is ready to at least start to investigate and prosecute it. At the end of the day, it should be the task of the Syrians, or it should be done in the region. So that's the really bad thing about it. The interesting thing is that there are some accountability mechanisms established at the level of the UN investigation commission, and very maybe not worth to be spelled out, but another kind of accountability mechanism called IIM on the UN level, which kind of expresses the desire of the international community that there has to be some investigation and prosecution, and as many already declared universal jurisdiction in Europe for that. We have also some positive tendencies right now, and that is that over the last 10 years, in many countries, war crimes unit, a specialized war crimes unit at the level of the police and also of the prosecutors' offices have been established, and they slowly develop and are now ready to act. And Syria is a particular good example because, as you all know, hundreds of thousands of Syrians flew to many Western European countries. And so here we have not only, let's say, a claim to the prosecutor, please investigate Sri Lanka or Congo, what we're usually doing. We can tell them, look, here are witnesses, here are torture survivors, here are lawyers who had been active in documenting these cases and pursuing them in Syria. So a huge potential for the prosecutor. And at some point, the prosecutor's office in Germany decided to take responsibility. And so then our organization, and that is the most important thing, together with exiled Syrian organization, especially with two exiled lawyers, Anwar Bouni and Mazen Darwish, we built up a strategy. We wanted to go after the highest responsibles. So not countering the practice of others who are celebrating the victory against impunity when a small-scale, torture crosses the border and gets arrested. We were saying the apparatus have to go after basically the security service directors, which they then did. So there is a huge structural investigation, especially because we work together also with a group around the military photographer Caesar, who collected all these ugly, awful photos you might know of dead corpses, where Syrian bureaucracy was in this regard helpful. They left little plaques on the bodies where you can see which units were involved. And this archive was given to the German prosecutor's office, and so they carry out a very, very sorrowful forensic analysis of the photos, trying to prove the system behind it. And so that's ongoing. And so there are two axes. One is, of course, whoever is then in Europe might be target of prosecution, but also, and that is, I think we can also say, due to our work, they are also looking after the higher ups. Some of them are still traveling through Europe, which is good, which is always important to remember. And we have achieved one arrest warrant in Germany against one of the most awful Secret Service guys. And we are now trying to bring case. Well, we have brought a case in Austria, where they also open an investigation. And next month we're going to Sweden, and we'll have another complaint. We have. It's already ready, and so the idea is not only to serve as a tool for Syria, in all the case, when you can go through the history of the last 30, 40 years, you will find for many situations in the world, even for situations where you wouldn't expect it, some kind of accountability mechanism, some kinds of trial, tribunal, domestic, mixed, international, domestic, and so on. And all these tribunals, whenever they take place, of course, we want them to happen very soon, but sometimes it lasted a while. But the Pinochet arrest, and that is maybe the most prominent example. In 1998, the lawyers in the case had to submit torture cases within hours to the judges in the UK. They were only able to do it because in the 70s, brave, human rights activists and lawyers collected the information, documented, and that is the case that is the case in many other situations. So the earlier you try to collect hard evidence, and whom do I tell that? You know that we need evidence which stands, which is valid for a criminal trial. It's not writing a report. It's more. And so as the effort of the Germans for the first time is also to understand international criminal justice as a division of labor, and their work now is gathering evidence, and they explicitly say it. We hope that in future the evidence we are collecting now and we are processing now will be used by future courts. Again, I won't give you any estimation because I don't think we can. But I think the more we do, the more we invest now, the better the prospects for future justice for Syria is.
I think I've been struck by seeing human rights work by the Justice Initiative here, where they'll file a case, and I'm a former journalist, so I'm like, well, what's the point? That's never going to work. And then something happens or something gives, which you wouldn't have expected to give, and that institutions, bits of them leak stuff that you wouldn't have expected them to leak. So the prospect of failure should never necessarily discourage trying. It's very, yeah. Madam, yeah.
I'm Mayan Dreyfus, and I was affiliated with the Global Bioethics Initiative. I'm concerned, I lived in China for a number of years, and I'm concerned with Tibet. 1 million Han Chinese have been sent to Tibet to dilute the gene pool, as far as I can see, and to destroy Tibetan culture and civilization, as well as, since I was subject to it myself, human rights abuses happen in China all the time to people like me, who just work for an institution they didn't approve of, and I was taken in to police headquarters and so forth. It was just absurd. But so many abuses happen in China, and they deny it. Xi Jinping has made himself ruler forever, so I don't see that dislodging him any human rights problems or court cases. How do you manipulate or change or address rights abuses in China?
So,
and all their properties, of course, that they take hold of.
So to summarize, it's a question about what the human rights response should be to human rights abuses in Tibet and China.
Open society. I mean, I'm not a fan of this political concept of liberal democracy, open society, but I have to refer to it. I mean, there are, if you have some kind of open society, the justice system, even the governments, are somehow open to address the international community, to at least pretend to respect international human rights standards. At some point, there's some civil society active, which can, I described the model of our work, and our model of the work is basically, you can call it a ping pong play, you can, whatever. It's about going back and forth, investigating in the country where the crimes have been committed, then finding a forum outside, then trying again within the country. The civil society reacts to that, puts pressure on the justice in the country, on the government, and that works definitely much better in more open societies. And even the Latin American countries in the last decades were more open than, let's say, North Korea, China, and others. So it's basically it's very, very difficult for us to do any case in China. Also, I mean, we had been discussing cases of labor rights violation, and there we had workshops. We discussed it with experts, and the experts were very clear on that point. They were saying, look, from our point of view, the most successful tool in China is mobilization on the level of the factory of the company. If you come with litigation, we don't think that it will have any impact on the situation. It was a clear. So we are not China experts. China expert recommended us something else. So this is also a kind of a. Shows the limits of our approach. That's the one thing. The other thing is, why would China sign, for example, the statute for the International Criminal Court? What the Chinese said in the last 15 years was smart enough. You say, look at your wonderful Western model. You have prohibited torture, but when the president of the US wants people tortured and go impune, they do it. You know, why are you telling us that we should prohibit torture and sign the ICC statute? And the same goes for many violations. Recently, we had a discussion in Berlin, a very high profile in the parliament. Parliamentarians, law professors, more conservative law professors, about the erosion of international law and the crisis of human rights law. And, you know, of course, immediately China and Russia comes up to our mind, and rightly so. But to my positive surprise, some of the law professors pointed to the 1999 Kosovo intervention of the NATO, the 2003 Iraq intervention, which was a clear breach of international law, the 2001 following years of torture, and said this set the stage for then Russia now invading Ukraine and so on. Because we live now in a multipolar world, and many of these more and more, powerful countries, to leave China and Russia apart, but Brazil or South Africa or India would say, why shouldn't we do the same thing as the Western states showed us the last 150 years? As long as they get along with international law, they respect it, and when required, they breach it. Yeah, and so we do the same, and that is unfortunately a very, very dangerous tendency.
Yes, sir.
My name is Rudra. I'm a private secretary here. I have two questions. One is on Sri Lanka. We start with Sri Lanka. The Human Rights Council passed a resolution calling for transitional justice for 2 years. Nothing happened. They gave another 2 years extension. Now it's going to end. So what the HRC can do about it? That's one question. The second question, can you sue the state itself? Because you said it is not a legal, it's a political, mostly the human rights violation. So can we sue the state itself rather than going after individuals? And I'm a little bit familiar with the Italian case against human. Can anything can be done like that under the existing?
Okay, so the first question was about the situation in Sri Lanka and the lack of political will of the governments in Sri Lanka to comply with the UN resolution who are calling for transitional justice in Sri Lanka. That's completely true, and that is a very sad story because at some point we had been in early 2009. There was the Operation Cast Lead in Israel in the Israel-Palestine war. There was the oppression of the Iranian opposition happening, and the last phase of the Sri Lanka civil war. The most victims were killed in Sri Lanka, and then also many of the survivors were put into camps and then tortured there. Women got raped. It was really a large-scale crime, but the Western public opinion nearly took no notice of that, first thing. And the second thing is for a number of geopolitical reasons, Sri Lanka was able to escape any kind of pressure. And the other way around, they held workshops for military in their country and show what a good example is to how basically you can defeat a liberation movement, if you want to call the LTTE that, but how you can abolish an armed opposition, and that is really sad. But what you have to say is, as bad that it looks, there are some efforts, first of all by really courageous lawyers and activists in Sri Lanka itself, which is really outstanding what they're doing there. I have to say it. It's really wonderful. But there is also efforts in a number of European countries, amongst them Germany. We presented a number of cases to the German Federal Prosecutor's Office. Of course, not on such a high scale as Syria, because there are only few, witnesses, and the exile community, the Sri Lankan exile community is much smaller, so there is not so much to investigate. But at least some of them have been asked by the prosecutor's office. So it's not a very satisfying situation for the moment, but this is not the end of the day. And the other question was, rather than go after individuals, can you also sue the state? Yes, you can, and you brought an example. That is the International Court of Justice case, Germany versus Italy. But obviously, the Inter-American European Court of Human Rights. You're suing also the states. So there are many other possibilities than only criminal justice or civil justice. So you can develop some kind of litigation also in the Sri Lankan case. That's the short answer.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back? You have to shout.
Okay, my name is Neil Feldman. Would you have international human rights courts jurisdiction over those different individual cases of Iran and other countries sending their agents to murder their own dissidents who are in Europe? And I mean, these are not mass murders, these are targeted killings. And does that constitute a human rights violation, or is that handled by the national country because it's taking place on its soil?
So the question being, in the case of there being assassinations carried out by a foreign nation on a European country's soil, who's responsible? What's the jurisdiction?
First of all, your question was also if this constitutes a human rights violation. Obviously, yeah. And but not every human rights violation means that an international crime has been committed. So you rightly pointed to the criminal type, and that is of course it's assassination, murder, and that in every country of the world, murder on your own territory can be investigated and prosecuted, and sometimes, as you might remember, sometimes some of the perpetrators have been arrested and put on trial. Sometimes they have served at least parts of their sentence. Sometimes they were traded, with other prisoners.
The Iranians did this fairly recently, I understand, in Europe.
Yeah, it goes on, and Iran, of course, is also. I mean, is also one of those countries. They got along with pretty much during the last 3 decades.
Yes, sir?
My name is Jeffrey Boone. I'm interested in a member of the study of human rights issues at Columbia University, and also I'm a passionate student of technology. Now, I have a question regarding United Nations. Actually, do they should take more aggressive steps, in preventing human rights abuses around the world, or because I realize that it's disturbing that they can't wait until large scale of human rights violation happening until the international community step in and do something about that. So we realize that happened in Syria, for example. They've been turning a blind eye for so long about those issues. So that's why the guys need to be still there. So do you think the United Nations should have more being aggressive about those issues, human rights violation on the large scale that's going on in Syria right now?
That's the question being, what should the United Nations not play a larger role in addressing major crimes against humanity and war crimes?
I guess that's the easiest question tonight, because the answer is a clear yes. I mean, yes, it should, and yes, it's a shame that not more happened, but yes, we should keep on working on that. I mean, we have no choice. The UN is the only international mechanism at that scale we have. We know about all the problems there, but we have to improve it, and we have, I mean, the whole framework has to be improved on one hand, and on the other hand, in every single case you just mentioned, we have to put pressure on them that they act more. And there are also some good examples. I mean, as I said, you know, there was no way to establish a special tribunal or to refer the case to the ICC because the UN Security Council in the case of Syria couldn't act because of the vetoes of Russia and China. By the way, a reaction to the invasion of Libya by the Western states, where Russia and China didn't veto the referral to the ICC, but at least some kind of accountability mechanism was established, and I think that is very important also for the legitimacy of the universal jurisdiction cases all over Europe, and it might serve also as a minimum basis for future prosecution or in the region or on an international level. And so there are examples how it could at least work a little bit, and we should definitely pressure for more.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Gypsy Ian Kaiser. I'm an advocacy and communications consultant. So the UN has spent quite a bit of time in recent months dedicating open discussion space to the crisis of multilateralism. And obviously you talk about the duality of Western states and complicity and sort of the global climate. And the question is, do you believe there is a crisis at the moment for multilateralism, and how does that affect the kind of justice that you're seeking?
So the question is there a crisis in multilateralism, and how does that affect your work?
As bad as the situation was before, it can get worse, and that is where we are right now. I mean, all the tendencies I described. I mean, an ICC who's like in a way stagnating, European Court of Human Rights, Inter-American Court of Human Rights, both under threat for different reasons. More and more states, you know, developing the Russian-Turkish argumentation. We don't want a foreign court to decide on our matters. You know, you hear that in Switzerland, in Austria, when it comes to migration issue. So there is definitely a tendency. I wouldn't call it a crisis. There is a tendency, and so we found ourselves in a very contradictory position that we have to defend institutions we're at the same time criticizing, but that's the case. I mean, as long as we have no other mechanisms, we should defend them, but at the same time make them better. And the good news is that there is not only the tendency towards, you know, especially populist tendency. You know, we are taking over, you know, the decisions over our country. Whatever you want to say to that, it's basically stupid. It's basically stupid. Let's call it like it is, because you know, in a globalized world where globalized economy, especially digitalized globalized economy, is taking over, to claim that is stupid, and we should call it stupid, and we should defend, you know, the little efforts. But at the same time, I think we have to be very and which I don't consider particularly as my task, but we should also put these human rights problems we're discussing here right now through our own efforts on the political agenda. We should be aware that in times of economic crisis, human rights might not be the most interesting issue and might not be a winning issue and that's what unfortunately how politicians think right now. And so we must definitely reach out to more people. We have to convince more people that human rights and the principle of human rights is not something, that protects one individual or one group, but the way of living.
So it's a question?
My name is Lee. I am a program officer in public health. I just wanted to know if you may share some of your reflections about how sufficient is the accountability mechanism in the Yemen situation.
Yeah, jumping from country to country. Super efficient, super efficient as we can all see. No, I mean it's another scandalous situation, the ongoing war in Yemen, and it's a pity that it needed a assassination of a single journalist to have a public outcry all over the world, that the war itself didn't provoke this outcry, but now I think we find ourselves in another situation, that people are more aware of it. And again, it's like when you file cases against Saudi Arabia, the clear message of everybody who talks honest to you is, we won't go against Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia is economically so important. And so again, and then they say, okay, the only option is that you are able to raise more attention and to put more pressure on your own governments and on your own justice authorities. So what we recently tried to build is litigation against European arms traders who export. I mean, this is another war feeded by European arms, not to talk of the others, by Western Europeans, the champions of human rights and democracy in Europe are all exporting to this region. And 5 years later, the region is another ecological and humanitarian disaster. The people have to flee, and then they complain about the new wave of migration. It's so obvious, and it makes me really angry. Also, today we heard that one of the companies which is heavily exporting to Yemen, to Saudi Arabia, Rheinmetall, will file a complaint against Germany because of the suspension of the arms contracts after the Khashoggi assassination. But we think that could be also a topic where a broader public is actually agreeing with what we're doing. So what we're now doing, we're going on the national level. We recently, earlier last year, we went to Italy and filed a complaint against the Italian state and the Rheinmetall daughter in Italy because of the arms trade. And the argument is not, as usually in this arms trade proceeding, just a breach of the export rules, but because the rules were obeyed, they allowed the arms export, and what we said, this is complicity into international crimes. And later this year, we want to bring a case to the International Criminal Court against the European arms traders. It will be a more risky case than for example, Syria, but we think it's worth it.
So I was going to ask you for a positive message at the end, but I think that might be it, that you're continuing to push the boundaries and what can be done with the law to confront power at its most cruel.
Yeah, and if you say we, I explicitly would refer to a much broader we than, you know, the small group of human rights organizations in Berlin, New York, and London. It's there is more and more going on. I just visited California and had a number of talks there, and it's so encouraging. And we just talked to Pamela and Pablo, who are just filming there, and it's so much resistance going on there. Maybe not of the big organization, very many local initiatives, many individuals, and the same is in Europe. I mean, we are in the middle of a very open situation right now, and each and everybody of us has to decide whether you want to be passive, or if you want to throw yourself into this struggle.
Wolfgang, thank you very much indeed.
Thank
and
you.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.